I am scared of trends. Generally, when a trend shows up, it's either bullshit or it's too late. And usually a combination of both.
Welcome to Two-Sided, the Marketplace podcast, brought to you by ShareTribe.
Hello and welcome. I am Sjoerd, CMO at ShareTribe, and I am your host. Welcome to the second episode of Season 3 of Two-Sided, where we'll talk to Sameer Singh, an angel investor known from his excellent blog on network effects, Breadcrumb.vc, former Atomico Angel, and currently venture partner at SpeedInvest. I've known Sameer for quite a while now, and I regularly revisit some of his writings. They're really terrific, and we'll discuss these a bit in the episode. But perhaps more importantly, we also discuss how Sameer evaluates marketplace businesses. For example, how to evaluate network effects. Sameer walks us through his 4-step evaluation process for investments, where he focuses on unique multiplayer interactions and defensibility. We'll also talk about the challenges in early-stage marketplaces. We discuss common mistakes made by aspiring marketplace founders, such as picking overly narrow markets or trying to tackle too many problems at once. I'm sure that does sound familiar for many of you. And finally, we discuss future trends in marketplaces, although Sameer basically says he doesn't really believe in trends. And so instead, he wants to emphasize the lasting power of network effects, and we'll explore some opportunities that are driven by behavioral shifts that Sameer sees, especially when it comes to Gen Z and AI technology. I think another terrific episode packed with valuable tips and insights. And if you're building a marketplace, you're going to love this. Now, here is my chat with Sameer Singh. Hi, Sameer. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Luckily, we're in the same time zone. I think that has been different in some of the previous recordings, but still, I appreciate you very much coming here and sharing your knowledge and experience. But before we dive into all of that, could you tell a little bit about yourself? Like, what did you do before you became an investor focusing on marketplaces?
Long story. I mean, the short version is I spent 5 years working for a startup called App Annie, which is not very well known in European circles, but reasonably well known in Silicon Valley circles. They raised $160 million from Sequoia, IVP, Greycroft. Company had an interesting trajectory. My role was basically to work with customers and help them understand how to use App Annie data. Turns out lots of customers had network effects, which was a topic I was familiar with because the way App Annie found me is when I was in India, I was writing a blog about mobile ecosystems and operating systems and applications built on top of them and how network effects actually sort of make these businesses work. So after those 5 years, I left App Annie. I wanted to go back to investing, which is what I was doing in India before App Annie. I knew I wanted to focus on network effects, which is something that I'd accidentally worked on over the last 5 to 10 years. So started by writing a few essays about network effects that I had learned. Pandemic hit, had a year to myself, basically wrote a book's worth of essays. From that, accidentally got pulled into the Atomico Angel program, started investing in network effect companies, ran into SpeedInvest. While doing that, joined them as a venture partner. In the meantime, a couple of folks reached out and said, hey, are you going to teach a course? And I said, about what? About the stuff you've been writing. I was like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing. And so one day I put out a LinkedIn post saying, hey, I'm going to teach a course about network effects next week. Does anyone want to join? 7 people showed up. And that's how I started teaching the course, which is now on Reforge. And that's kind of the long story, or short version of the long story about.
Yeah, no, I think that was an excellent summary because I wasn't sure, like, before the interview, like, what we can talk about because I knew what we could talk about, but more like what to pick because you've done loads of things. And for the people listening at home, I can definitely recommend checking out Sameer's work. Is it still under breadcrumb.vc? Is that where you can find everything?
Yeah, everything should be there.
Yeah, so that's like, because it is an incredible set of primers on the different network effects and how they work. So please, if you're at home and you're a marketplace founder, then I would recommend checking that out. Yeah, so actually maybe a little bit about that. We can maybe take that line for now. So your specialty is really like network effects. When you evaluate offers or requests to invest, like, do you have a process that you go through, or what? How do you evaluate those, especially within the light of network effect?
I've actually open sourced this part of my high level evaluation on my about page, which you can find on
Okay.
Breadcrumb.vc as well. But I follow a 4-step process. If I were to be sort of very, very simplistic about it, there are lots of nuances in each.
Yeah.
The first one, and I wouldn't say I'm a stickler for this, but it helps, is what is the personal relationship that the founder has with the problem that he's solving? Like, is this just about starting a company about money? Are you a mercenary, or is there something else that is driving you? Something that, what's their core belief about this problem and why it's worth solving? So I prefer missionaries or mercenaries. That's the saying I like to use. But that's sort of just sort of on the person and their motivations. Right? When we actually get into the proposition itself, the first question I have is this product creating a unique, structured multiplayer interaction between two or more users? If you don't have that, you don't have a network effect. So that's just a very, very simple yes or no question. And so the way I try and evaluate that is just ask the founder to break down how the product works like I'm a 5-year-old, step by step, and so I can figure out whether it actually fits into that construct or not.
Yeah. Could you give an example? Because I think I understand what it means, but I'm not sure, like, if all of our
So
listeners are.
I'll give you an example,
Yeah.
like a marketplace example and a non-marketplace example in my
Sure.
portfolio, right? A non-marketplace example being How About, which is
Mm.
a social calendar. The way the product works is you go in, you invite your friends, you add stuff to your calendar. Your friends can see your calendar, you can see their calendar. And so you kind of initially could figure out, hey, when's everyone available? It's a whole lot easier than trying to figure that out on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So kind of the original idea was to bring the Google Calendar workplace experience to your friends.
Yeah.
And of course, over time, there have been sort of other enhancements and the product has gotten more and more social. But essentially, that at its core, that was sort of the multiplayer interaction.
Got it.
The second on a marketplace front is a company called Home Cooks, a marketplace for independent home chefs. And the way it worked is chefs cooked in batches. Home Cooks would pick up the food, store it in a freezer, and then deliver it to consumers across the country. And the chefs were only paid once the dish was sold. So it was a consignment-based marketplace.
Got
So
it.
the first one, How About, is a multiplayer interaction between users to share time.
Yeah.
The second one is a multiplayer interaction between independent chefs and consumers to sell food.
Got it.
The third point delves into a lot of my frameworks that I've written on Breadcrumb.vc. Does this interaction create a network effect that is scalable and defensible? Or at least it's not sort of the worst category of network effects, because network effects have a spectrum, right? So for a marketplace, for example, is it cross-border? Are you connecting users? Both buyer and seller need to be in the same location, or can they be in different locations when they're transacting? If they're in different locations, the marketplace is a bit more scalable. And of course, this is not binary. The spectrum, for example, Home Cooks can help a chef in London and a consumer in Scotland to transact. But right now, it doesn't help a chef in London transact with a consumer in China, for example, right?
Got it. Yeah.
Whereas, for example, Airbnb would do that. So here as well, you would see a spectrum. And then on the defensibility side, for a marketplace, the more unique and differentiated each unit of supply is, the longer tail your supply is, and therefore the more defensible you are, the higher the bar to reaching critical masses.
Yeah.
And of course, for different types of network effects, the specific levers that make them scalable or defensible would be different. So depending on what the interaction is, what makes what I look for in that third step tends to vary a little bit.
Got
And then the final step is this interaction showing early indications of working? And generally, that is not growth at the stage that I'm investing in.
No.
I try and look for companies that have some early meaningful sample size of users. So if, like, it's a consumer social product, you have a few thousand active users. If you have a marketplace, you have 50 to 100 monthly transactions. So there's enough in that the behavioral metrics are not noisy. And so the kind of things I'd be looking at, let's say for a marketplace, would be search to fill. The percentage of users who, say, come onto the marketplace and end up making a transaction, is that going up over time? And so as you add demand and supply to the marketplace, is search to fill going up? If it's not going up, the interaction is not working. And similarly, if it's a marketplace that has specific units of supply that are being sold, so you have sort of limited capacity, is the utilization rate going up? The percentage of supply that's being sold as you add supply and demand to the marketplace. Now, if it's a higher frequency marketplace, you might look at things like transaction frequency, is that going up? If it's something like a social network, you might sort of define this is the core action that is done in the product. Is the frequency of that going up over time as you add users? So it's more behavioral metrics. You're trying to gauge user behavior to figure out if you're seeing early signs of network effects kicking in or not, as opposed to things like growth.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Like, could you maybe is it possible that you give this by a recent example where you sort of made an investment or you suggested making an investment where you're like, okay, this one, like you said, like it's not a binary situation, so maybe they score strong on point 1 and maybe less on 3, but maybe could you talk us through like a recent investment?
Let me go back to how about, because it's an example I've used in my Reforge course as well, and people can sort of clearly see the link between early metrics and sort of what's happened over time.
Yeah.
So I saw how about when they had about 5,000 monthly active users back in late 2020. At this time, the product was still sort of very rough around the edges. The UX wasn't great, and back then it was simply just a calendar. You couldn't even chat with users. You could add friends. You could share your calendar with them. They could see your calendar. You could see their calendar, and you could go in and create plans and invite them to plans. That's pretty much it. It worked exactly like calendar. There wasn't anything else in the product back then.
Got it.
And so the only things you could evaluate were, one, how many events were users creating, and how was that changing over time, and how many events were people responding to, and how was that changing over time.
Yeah.
Both of those, like the events created per user and the responses per user, had gone up by anywhere between 3 to 6x over like 6 months.
Okay.
I think the user base had doubled, little less than doubled over that time frame.
Yeah.
So clearly something was kicking in with user behavior.
Yeah.
Right? So like you were seeing a clear inflection point in user behavior.
Yeah.
So which told you that the network effects were kicking in for that early base of users for that one narrow use case.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I'm looking for.
Got it. Yeah. By the way, it was probably a risky time also for that particular, because it was COVID, like, all right, wasn't it? Like, what did you say? Did you say 2020?
It was COVID, and in fact, this was even during lockdowns. This was happening, which was it's incredibly interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. For a marketplace that is about people meeting up in real life, that's a very not a marketplace, but a platform,
a network. Yeah. So instead, apparently, people were just sort of scheduling things like video game hangouts and virtual chats and stuff like that, and that just turned. And once the lockdown opened up, it sort of accelerated even more.
Yeah. Do you have any preference when you evaluate marketplaces specifically about should they be focusing on the supply side or the demand side? Like, where do you usually see where the problems are, or is it too dependent to say?
It's very, very specific to each market. I'd be very hesitant to give a broad answer there. Generally speaking, it tends to be which side has the bigger problem. Now you want both sides to have the problem, because if both sides don't have the problem, you don't have a marketplace.
No.
You just have one side of your market, the other side is not interested.
Yeah.
But typically, one side has a massive hair on fire problem, and one side has a slightly less hair on fire problem. And the slightly less hair on fire problem is the side you need to get first.
Okay.
Because that's what will make or break. But that's the harder side of the marketplace that will make or break. In a consumer marketplace, typically consumers are the harder side. The demand side tends to be the harder side. In many cases, suppliers always want to sell.
Yeah.
But you always want to get some critical mass of supply before you want to get a marketplace. So I've seen people go at this in sort of various ways. You can collect a wait list, then go to supply and onboard them, or you can get an initial sort of base supply, see if you're finding any sort of hotspots on the demand side with that initial supply, and sort of expand that out first before you attract more supply.
Yeah.
So there's sort of various ways to do it. You might say there's multiple ways to skin a cat, but it's very unique to each marketplace. The interaction, it depends on what the interaction is.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. When you think about like, if I'm, the audience will be mostly like early stage or aspiring marketplace founders, like, are there any trends that you're seeing in terms of like types of marketplace or categories or particular industries where you feel like, okay, there is still a massive, because I've talked to several investors before, and some of them just simply still believe in the marketplace model, right? Like, I think we met actually last time at the marketplace conference, and Jose Maren from FJ Labs was saying there that people still come to them and saying, well, aren't all the marketplaces done? And no, actually, their opinion is no. Actually, there's super many opportunities still on multiple areas, whether that is industries or models or particular network effects that you're like, okay, you get excited when you see a pitch like that seems to point to one.
So I'm going to give you a slightly boring and part controversial answer. One part of my answer is sort of similar to I think what they mentioned in the sense that I'm evaluating network effects, not specific spaces. So I'm fairly agnostic on vertical. I am scared of trends. Generally, when a trend shows up, it's either bullshit
Mm-hmm.
or it's too late.
Okay.
And usually a combination of both. I'll give you an example, right?
Yeah.
We've all heard of the sharing economy
Yeah.
trend that sort of happened sort of a decade ago. You go back and really unpack it. Like, what was in that trend?
Yeah.
You had Uber.
Yeah.
I guess there was a bit of sharing involved in the beginning.
Yeah.
You had Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
You had a bit of sharing involved in the beginning.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. And if you actually compare Uber and Airbnb's companies, they have nothing in common.
No.
It was a term made up by a couple of investors who kind of wanted to talk about it in the press. And that just became its whole thing. And a whole bunch of companies in that space got funded and went bust. Even now, like, to be honest, like, you ask me about a lot of the quote unquote trends that are happening right now. And I fundamentally question whether any of those companies are actually investable.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, so trends are something I stay away from. I also
Yeah.
think that as investors,
Mm.
sometimes we get too opinionated on what problems are worth solving. And I
Yeah.
don't think we as investors are close enough to the problem to be able to assess that. I think the founders are the ones who are close to the problem
Yeah.
and to work out A, if that problem is worth solving, and B, if that what the solution to that problem is. Now, when they come to us with this, as investors who are sort of focused on one particular niche of investing, my job is to go through that 4-step process and go, hey, is this actually a
Yeah.
network effect, or is it something like Kazoo where they're sort of buying and selling cars? So that's another trend that we can talk about, right? Second, does it actually have strong network effects? And
Mhm.
irrespective of what marketplace comes to me, I'm able to evaluate what it is because
Yeah.
network effects are math at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And you can see the behavior of how it's going so far. So I'm going to be using that process no matter what. So I don't have any point of views on trends. Like, the only thing I can add is perhaps AI can enable the creation of new marketplaces
Mhm.
just as a new technology that couldn't have existed previously.
Yeah.
And so perhaps there's room for AI-enabled interactions.
Yeah.
Like, frankly, I'm quite underwhelmed by a lot of the AI businesses I'm seeing right now.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping at some point people figure out that AI as products is not really going to cut it. And we go back to building actual businesses with sort of technology under the hood as opposed to selling technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good take. I really like that. Is there, I understand that you're like, you take the position of sort of being agnostic and you just take your model and project that on what is in front of you. But maybe then more a question of like, are there particular areas where you see opportunity still, that where there's a clear lagging behind, or maybe like some kind of technology adoption or the adoption of platform model where you're like, okay, I think like that you believe that there's a model there's just hasn't come the right player to do it, for example.
Specific models, no, but if I were to give you broad strokes, like
Yes,
the most
please.
interesting companies are formed on sort of two shifts, one of two shifts, right? One is a behavioral shift. Like, people are more comfortable doing something than today as opposed to
10
previous
years ago.
generations. So
Yeah.
Gen
Yeah.
Z, for example, their behavior tends to be slightly different. So I do think there's room for new consumer products that tap into that behavior. And so how about sort of being a really good example? I think 20 years ago, if you asked people to share their calendars with each other and essentially create a social network after that, I think they would look at you funny.
Yeah.
But I think today that's, especially within younger generations, that's a whole lot more normalized. The second is, and if you were to go back to the past, people staying in each other's homes
Yeah.
20, 30 years ago, ridiculous concept, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Behavioral change makes it acceptable because the internet has just sort of normalized some of that behavior. Second is technology change. Something that was not possible before is possible now, which enables our new propositions and products.
Yeah.
So if you go back to Uber, it's not that you could not have order a taxi on the internet before. It
Yeah.
was just painful.
Yeah.
And now with a smartphone in the driver's hand and in the user's hand, you
Yeah.
can press a button and track the car where it was. And so that enabled smartphone GPS enabled Uber, and ubiquity of smartphones enabled
Yeah.
Uber.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where, does AI under the hood actually do something? Maybe. Like, I would hesitate to say we've seen a ton of those
Yeah.
so far, but that's one possibility on the technology side. On the behavior side, I think Gen Z growing up smartphone native has some interesting behaviors that leads to new products as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. We were in an earlier conversation with someone else. We were talking about like one possibility would be like, because a lot of the marketplaces basically enable some sort of like information symmetrization, right? Like I need to know what's the price or how many vendors are out there, or etc. And that like AI has a good opportunity to sort of synthesize all that information and somehow how equalize that, like if you think about, for example, thumbtack, or if you need to specify as a consumer a particular job to the side of the marketplace, AI can assist. I believe that in the same way, the other way around, that like a way for the consumer to get a summary of what is out there and get some kind of, because even a good search, or like if just purely from the marketplace perspective, you like a good categorization and search, etc. You still need to do a lot of work as a consumer to figure out on some of these sort of, if you think about home services, for example, specifically, to figure out like what is out there. And if there's something, I feel that that's where AI could potentially do the work, like some sort of assistant. But
I mean, perhaps with stuff like that, sort of the second question in my framework pops up, right? Is there actually a unique interaction? So let's say you were to take a thumbtack like marketplace
yeah,
and leverage AI to sort of facilitate better matchmaking. Like fundamentally the same interaction. And so the question is like, what areas can you actually create novel interactions and new behavior? Like I'll give you an example of a portfolio company that's very, very early in their journey. But essentially what they were doing was the moment you signed up, you would integrate your email. They would pull all of your historical purchases
yeah,
and create a feed of all the products that you owned. And of course, the reason AI is important there is if you actually do that, you'll end up with a lot of like batteries and hammers and nails, stuff that is not interesting to anyone.
yeah, 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 yeah,
And so AI has to decide what is interesting.
yeah.
And then you're trying to create a social interaction based around sort of that metadata, right? Creating that metadata would not really be possible without AI. So is there something that can be done with that? And this is where sort of founder creativity really comes into its own. Right? I'm not, I think, the most creative person. My job is not to come up with the
Yeah,
startup.
yeah,
Thankfully,
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
think I would do a very good job at that.
yeah.
But when I see it,
You can
I can evaluate
evaluate. Yeah,
if this is unique or not. And I think a lot of AI enabled marketplaces we're seeing right now are basically struggling with that unique component in the
yeah.
sense that, hey, this is AI that makes this easier. Like, sure, yes, but the existing marketplace is doing that too because it's obvious for them to do that.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you mentioned like you wouldn't be a creative founder yourself. Talk to so many founders. If you're an aspiring marketplace founder today, what is some advice you would give to someone? Like what are some mistakes that you see marketplace or sort of two-sided platform founders make early on that you feel like, oh, you're like, this is not a good decision?
The most obvious one is picking a space that doesn't have enough fragmentation. You often see this in B2B marketplace founders because a lot of these folks are from the B2B world and they're sort of accustomed to direct selling. You would have a situation where either one side of the marketplace basically just has 3 participants, or you need like 3 to 10 participants to actually make it work. And once you have them, once you have a quote unquote marketplace like that, it's very, very easy to replicate
Yeah.
because a competitor would need 3 to 10 suppliers
Yeah.
or buyers, right? So in the event where there's only 3 companies on one side of the marketplace, those 3 companies have all the power and they can work with whoever they choose,
Yeah.
including all of your competitors.
Yeah.
In the event that there's tons of those companies, but you only need 3 to 10, it's not a huge barrier for the other company to go and get those as well. So it's like they're not really workable, viable marketplaces in any way. And it's the most common mistake I end up seeing. The second common mistake is founders that go way too broad. Like they want to build like 10 things. They think that those 10 things combined is a compelling product, even if one of those each of those individually is not a compelling product. That's not how it works. When you're building a marketplace or a network effect, and this is probably good advice for sort of most startups, even outside of network effects,
Yeah. Yeah.
is
100%.
you really need a wedge to ensure that all engagement and liquidity is sort of concentrated around that interaction, right? It's a very, very specific problem, very specific interaction. The moment you've created like 10 of those, you're fragmenting the attention of your buyers and customers across all 10 of those, meaning everyone's not doing all 10. Different users are doing different things, and you probably don't have enough concentrated engagement on any sort of one of those surfaces.
Yeah.
And basically that tends to never work.
Yeah.
Those are the most 2 common issues that I see.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, like the first one is sort of coming back to network effects. You just simply don't, have network effects if there's three on one side. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Is there any company that you missed? I think like, I don't remember who maybe it's Andreessen Horowitz or someone like one of those who are like the biggest ones. The misses are the ones that you don't invest in. Do you have one or two you're like, oh, I was completely wrong on this one? Maybe you don't even need to name names, but you're like, oh, I totally misjudged that one.
So
On
it's always hard to say unless you're sort of 10 years in. But there's
Mm.
probably examples of companies that I have seen that have ended up doing well.
Yeah.
So if I were to look at network effects in particular,
Yeah.
there was a company called, the first one, like this is the company I wanted to do, I just missed out on. Like I couldn't get into the round. A company called No Unity in Germany, which is sort of a social network for students to share notes. So the good students would share notes with others and become influencers on the app, and it was it's doing phenomenally well. That's a company I knew would do well. I just didn't manage to get into the round.
Yeah.
In terms of the ones that I missed, two ones I can think of. One of them, the name escapes me. It was an EF company that was a B2B marketplace, and it ended up raising a Series A from Index.
Mm-hmm.
I think it started with a P. I forget the name. The second was a company called Tilt. I saw it at pre-seed. It was sort of a whatnot like marketplace for collectibles.
Yeah.
Like I have some questions about the model, but so far the execution has been phenomenal. They raised just I think 10-12 million Series A from Balderton recently.
Okay.
And I do think highly of the founder. So that one is so far looks like a miss.
Yeah.
Another is a company called Passion Fruit. There's two different companies called Passion Fruit, so it's very confusing.
Yeah.
But one of them was a marketplace for freelance marketers. And here again, I have some questions about the model, but they did raise a 9 million Series A recently. So far, it looks like it's a bit of a miss from me.
Yeah.
But we will see how what happens.
Can we dive
going
into
forward?
that one for a moment? Because
Yeah.
so a marketplace for freelance marketers. So how is that like? This is I think one of the fields that often gets still identified as a area of opportunity. I'm taking this very broadly about like this labor or future of work kind of thing. So what specifically? Because I don't know the names, but I've come across several platforms for even specifically marketers. So what made you excited about that particular execution or idea or revenue model? What was there that we're like, okay, this is special?
It was probably more the founders, to be honest, than the idea.
Got it.
Like Rafi and Isa both were sort of extremely impressive, really deep in their space.
Yeah.
So of all the founders I'd seen in that space, they were probably the most impressive. That one thing that I wasn't sure about it was exactly what you mentioned, in that how does the space look comparatively as you grow?
Yeah.
And there were a few things behaviorally that I wasn't entirely sure on, which to the founders' credit, they managed to correct over time. But the competition question is sort of is an open one, and it's sort of and there's this probably true for a couple of the ones that I passed on that ended up doing well. In that I'm not entirely sure how competition looks over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's then I guess conclude like on the last question, which we kind of touched on, danced around a little bit, like coming to competition and as you grow and same as like the area of interest in AI. Like, what do you see if you think about, like imagine you would be raising your own fund. Breadcrumb.vc gets let's say seed fund. What would be in your pitch, or what do you think that like what does the marketplace landscape look like in the next 5 years? Like, where do you see opportunities, developments, things coming together? You've mentioned already some things, but is there a way to summarize sort of this in a message for people looking for an idea to get excited about?
Again, probably not going to give you an idea, but what I'll say with network effects tend to be one of the strongest sources of defensibility you can have in software, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the possible sources of defensibility available to startups,
Yeah.
there's really only three meaningful ones, maybe 3.5. There's embedding, switching costs. So like Salesforce, once you start using it, you're married to it. Like you cannot rip it out of your business.
Yeah.
There's economies of scale. So as you start investing in your business, it becomes more and more expensive for competitors to compete with you. The examples would include things like airline businesses where you need to buy a massive fleet of planes, Netflix where you need to have massive infrastructure and content investments to make it work, Google, which needed to have these massive data center investments to get search to work. They wanted to be able to index the web. And the third really is network effects. That's
Yeah.
pretty much it. You don't really have to, things like brand aren't relevant to startups because that's customer happiness accumulated over time. That's the best definition you can have for a brand.
Yeah.
And so I would argue the network effects are probably the most powerful of those three within the startup world. And mathematically, network effects don't really change. They're math is math, right? Irrespective of what behavioral change happens, what societal change happens, what technology change happens. Like people kept asking me, oh, what does crypto do to change network effects? What does AI do to change network effects?
Yeah.
The answer is nothing. Network effects are math.
Yeah.
It's math. And my pitch would start with math doesn't change.
Yeah. Okay.
Network effects have existed as long as humans have existed.
Yeah.
Language has network effects. The earliest markets have network effects.
Yeah.
That's why they work. Civilizations had network effects.
Yeah.
And now we're just implementing network effects in the business world.
Yeah.
And so this is a perennial, I would hesitate to use the word trend, but a perennial factor
Yeah.
that makes outsized businesses. And the NFX have done some great work on figuring out exactly what percentage of high value businesses had some component of network effects.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's not going to change going forward. That's sort of a ground truth.
Yeah.
I will mention sort of those two facets of behavioral change and technology change creates new businesses. So
Yeah.
Gen behaviors and perhaps AI enables new value propositions that network effect essentially just supercharge.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think that's also still like good advice to take if you're like a marketplace founder or early stage founder, like see which, like, how can you get to those network effects the fastest? Is there really, I think, like coming back to the point you made about not having enough suppliers, that is like a good evaluation also. And of course, like, doesn't mean it's not a good marketplace business, just not a venture sized marketplace business potentially. So that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Sameer. If people want to follow up on this conversation, they can find you at Breadcrumb.vc, correct?
Yeah, and if you want to have any questions, you have a pitch, I'm at Sameer at Breadcrumb.vc. I don't need a warm intro, just email me.
All right. Thanks, Sameer. Thanks a lot for your time.
All right, thanks, Jörg. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Two-Sided, the Marketplace podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you really liked it, please give us a rating or a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. If you got inspired to build your own marketplace, go visit www.sharetribe.com. It's the fastest way to build a successful online marketplace business.